Chapter 1.7 Scale and Proportion. These are principles of art. Remember, they are more complex than the elements of art they are built upon. The goals for this chapter are to understand the effects of scale, how artists rely on proportion, often to create meaning, and to know the difference between scale and proportion. Scale is the size of an object or artwork relative to another object or artwork. Often the scale is considered in relation to the human body or the environment that surrounds the artwork. Basically, it is usually something external to the artwork that determines its scale. The two terms that form the spectrum for how we talk about scale are miniature and monumental. Everything in between could be described as average or normal. So on the top left, Claes Oldenburg's huge outdoor sculpture of a gardening trowel is considered to have monumental scale. He is famous for making ordinary objects in large scale like this one. Figure 4.4.9, William Wigman's Statue of Liberty, is a miniature sculpture, quite possibly the world's smallest sculpture, as we are looking through a microscopic lens into the head of a sewing needle. At first glance, we wouldn't think that scale could communicate meaning, but the prevalence of enlarged figures throughout the artwork of the prehistoric and classic art periods is so noticeable that it has its own term, hierarchical scale, that indicates the relative importance of figures in an image. Historically, larger size has meant greater importance, and smaller size less importance. This is visible in the Mayan relief sculpture on the bottom right, where the ruling figure is twice as large as the figures that surround him. In modern times, artists have flipped that script. On the top left, Jean Millet placed lower-class workers front and center in the foreground of his landscape painting. Now he did it subtly because those female farm workers must be larger than everyone in the background to make the perspective believable. We don't think much of content like this these days, but back in the 1800s, this was a highly controversial artistic decision because Millet used hierarchical scale to make these working-class women the main subject of his painting. Distorted scale. It didn't get the status of a vocabulary word in our textbook. It's a little tangential and it's a little like hierarchical scale, except you can think that distorted scale changes the size of subjects to express meaning other than political power. This approach to the size of shapes within an artwork was very popular with surrealist artists like Dorothea Tanning in the early 1900s. In her painting on the top left, the doors, the sunflower, and the figures are all different sizes, yet none of the differences in scale are attempting to communicate power over their surroundings. Rather, the odd distortions in scale create a surreal, dreamlike effect on the viewer. Alright, here is proportion, the other principle discussed in this chapter. Proportion is different from scale. Let's try to understand how to articulate that difference by investigating proportion. This diagram of traditional vase shapes can help. Consider vase A on the left as a fairly standard vase shape. Its width and height are average. Now look at vase B in the middle. The height has been elongated and the width narrowed. It's taller and skinnier, and generally we describe that as elegant and light. Vase C on the far right has had the opposite mutation from the standard vase shape. Vase C has been shortened and made wider, giving it visual heaviness and sturdiness. We can see by these permutations in a common object such as a vase that help us to understand that proportion is the relationship between a work's individual parts and the whole. Let's talk about that difference between proportion and scale, because it will matter on the assessments. It can be a little confusing at first, so you can think of scale as generally referring to the size of an artwork in relation to its environment, and proportion generally refers to the different size of parts within a single artwork. The term hierarchical scale can also add confusion, but that term is used in specific historical contexts to denote political subject matter. Another quick example. On the bottom left are pale orange shapes. Again, I will use changes in those shapes to illustrate the point. If I want to change the scale of the square, I can reduce or enlarge its size while maintaining its squareness. But if I want to change its proportions, then I am altering the basic shape, and it no longer exists as a square. If I elongate the width of a square, it becomes a rectangle, and I have altered its proportion. Likewise, if I elongate its height, I have also altered the proportion. Proportion has its own interesting facets. Our human connection to visual proportion really started by using our hands as units of measurement. This was done for commerce and for art. The Greeks were going for realistic proportions in their figurative sculptures, but other cultures were not. This Nigerian Oni figure has an intentionally larger head than its body. That the proportion of the head is larger than the body communicates the mental powers of the monarchy. Though generally we wouldn't say the head has hierarchical scale over the body, since the 3D form is all one subject. Proportion includes the geometric divisions of the picture plane. The rule of thirds is one of the more popular examples of this way of mathematically dividing a surface into a grid that will help determine the compositional layout. Painters often utilize such approaches, and we can see here in William Turner's painting how intentional his composition is by comparing it to the rule of thirds grid that he almost certainly used before he even began to paint. The rule of thirds divides the picture plane into 3 equal parts, both along its height and its width. The classical Greeks were somewhat obsessed with geometry and naturalistic proportions. From these examples, we can see that they had mathematical systems for determining the average size of the human body and the average proportions of features on a body. In this example, the height of the body is 7 head lengths. The sculptor has also utilized the golden ratio to establish the proportion between the height of the body and the natural length of the arms. The golden section, or golden ratio, is a mathematically identifiable ratio in length between 1 and 1.618. It is a repeatable proportion that appears in many natural forms, most noticeably the spiral of seashells and the curling of ferns. The golden section can be used in a variety of ways. It can create a spiral by rhythmically reducing and nesting squares to form an infinitely diminishing point. Artists such as Henry Robinson have used the proportions to define their compositions. The arc of the ladies in the foreground is intentionally created by the spiral of the golden section. As that spiral curves around to its ever-diminishing point, we stare uselessly at the curtain and realize the man staring out the window must feel equally useless as he witnesses a loved one dying. The intentional use of geometry can have a strong impact on the meaning of an artwork. Back to the Greeks. Nobody is sure how much they figured out on their own or how much they simply recorded from previous cultures, but they are a wealth of geometric comprehension. They used determinate mathematical proportions for nearly everything they did. The facade, the front of the Parthenon, has the proportions of the rectangle created by the nesting squares of the golden section.